Favorite movie time. Hello everybody, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Teray, and if you didn't guess, today we're going to be covering my favorite movie of all time, the late Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys. So I'm a huge Lost Boys fan. I got into Lost Boys, I think around age 15, when it was still on Netflix, one of the many times they put it on and off. It's been kind of playing volleyball with Netflix for quite some time. But it's a movie that I always go back to because it's fun and vampires. So guilt-free vampires, because I got into it around the time that Twilight had been over for a couple years and it wasn't okay to like Twilight yet. So I found the next best vampire-related thing that I would actually enjoy, and that was Lost Boys. So before I get into discussing the movie, I do want to kind of plug some of the merch that I have. This shirt, which I got for my 16th birthday, which was in fact Lost Boys themed. And I also have several photographs that from a birthday party that I had, because my 16th birthday was also Lost Boys themed, and a signed poster from Billy Wirth and G. Tom Mack that was a gift from a friend for my birthday, and then a ticket to see Lost Boys at the State Theater in Modesto, California when they showed it, which I showed up to in drag dressed as a vampire, because of course I would. I also want to plug this really cool mug really quick. That is a Lost Boys Missing poster mug. It's got all 4 of the boys, David, Dwayne, Paul, and Marco, and I purchased that from Little Shop of Gore, which eventually, when Sinister Creature Con finally comes back, I'm not sure if they still do a booth there because I did buy the mug in 2017, but that is the shop I purchased from. You can go to their website and purchase this mug right now, along with a lot of other really cool stuff and horror merch that they have on the website. So, now that I've plugged some small local businesses, let's get into the movie. The Lost Boys came out in 1987, directed by the late Joel Schumacher, executive produced by Richard Donner. It is a story about 2 young boys, brothers, Sam and Michael, who moved to the fictional city of Santa Carla with their mother after her divorce from their father, and Michael gets sucked into a gang of motorcycle riding, leather wearing vampire boys. Now, the movie didn't start out with that concept. It really didn't. I've watched a lot of the special edition stuff that comes with that DVD copy that I have. It originally started out as kind of like a more Peter Pan-esque type thing that was supposed to be more for children. Joel Schumacher's initial concept was something similar to The Goonies, which was also executive produced by Richard Donner. But the concept changed and developed over time, and it became the cult classic film that we have today. Now, I always really think the cast is an important thing to discuss in regards to film, and this cast was incredible. Now, it's really odd that The Lost Boys is kind of so underappreciated as it is, because it was the first movie where the 2 Coreys ever worked together. The 2 Coreys being Corey Feldman and the late Corey Haim. But on top of that, you have Diane Weiss, who a lot of people will know as the mom from Edward Scissorhands, as Lucy, Sam and Michael's mother. Michael, played by Jason Patric. Star, played by Jamie Gertz. Laddie, Chance Michael Corbett. Grandpa, who is probably a favorite character of mine, played by the late Bernard Hughes. Max, played by the great Ed Herman. And then our vampire boys. Now, some of the names aren't going to be as familiar, but if you're an 80s movie or 80s culture fan, you're going to recognize at least 2. And those 2 are Kiefer Sutherland, who obviously people will know from 24, Young Guns, Stand By Me, playing David, the leader. Billy Wirth, playing Dwayne, who doesn't talk, and his name is never mentioned in the film, so I won't blame you if you don't know who he is, but he's the shirtless one with the long hair. Paul, played by the late Brooke McCarter, who's the Thrasher one that the fandom has affectionately dubbed the Twisted Sister looking one. And then lastly, my personal favorite character, Marco, played by Alex Winter, who many will recognize as Bill S. Preston Esquire from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, and now Bill and Ted Face the Music. And we then, kind of wrapping everything out, we have Jameson Newlander playing Alan Frog, the brother of Corey Feldman's character Edgar Frog, and the second friend to Corey Haim playing Sam Emerson, Michael's younger brother. So now that I've kind of laid out the plot and the cast, let's get into the film itself and what I like so much about the film. Now, I said that the cast oftentimes makes the film. However, there is something that is more important than the cast in regards to setting the tone and the ambiance for any movie. And that, obviously, is the soundtrack. And Lost Boys has one hell of a soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack itself is one that I really like, but the thing with the soundtrack is most of the songs in the film that are on the track have been played in some way, shape, or form by the first 45 minutes of the movie. However, that doesn't stop it from being a killer soundtrack. So going down the track list, we have tracks 1 and 4, which are Good Times and Laying Down the Law by INXS and Jimmy Barnes. Then track number 2 is the track that plays in probably one of the coolest, most iconic scenes in the film, and that is where they're all on the motorcycles riding across the beach, and that is Lost in the Shadows by Lou Gramm. Song number 3 is one that's only in the credits, and that is Roger Daltrey's cover of Elton John's Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. Song number 4, which plays in the opening of the film, not the opening, the introduction sequence to the film, and that is Echo and the Bunnymen's cover of The Doors' People Are Strange, which I actually prefer to the original. Then we have, I'm going to skip song number 6 for now because that deserves its own little section. We have Power Play by Eddie and the Tide, I Still Believe by Tim Capello, which is another very iconic scene in the film, which is the shirtless saxophone man at the beach concert in the very beginning. And then we have Beauty Has Her Way by Mummy Calls, and then To the Shock of Miss Louise, which was the carousel song for the carousel that is on the Santa Cruz Boardwalk, which is where a majority of the film was played. Now, I said I was going to leave out number 6 in the initial run-through of this because it deserves its own section, and it does. Track number 6 is what became the theme song for this movie, and that is Gerard McMahon, aka G. Tom Mack's song Cry Little Sister. And that song kind of became the cornerstone of the film. That's the film's calling card. So much so that the legacy of that song continues to endure throughout all iterations. Any sequel, both of the sequels for Lost Boys, The Tribe and The Thirst, both featured different covers of Cry Little Sister because it's a universally acknowledged truth that there can be no version of The Lost Boys without some version of Cry Little Sister, because that song has become so synonymous to the story and to the subject matter and to the characters and the culture of the film. And I think that is something so incredibly cool about the soundtrack and that specific thing. And it's even cooler because G. Tom Mack has taken that legacy and he's used that platform to kind of create a space for there to be a musical adaptation of The Lost Boys, with Joel Schumacher's blessing, of course. But the soundtrack for that is also very cool and also kind of has the similar feel to Cry Little Sister, and I really appreciate that because he knows that there's such an enduring legacy behind this film. It's a good movie. I mean, even without a good soundtrack, it'd still be an excellent movie. But the soundtrack is really important to kind of understand the ambiance because the soundtrack is very much a late 80s soundtrack. And considering the movie takes place in the late 80s, it came out in 87, but it's so quintessential to have a soundtrack that really reflects and can set the tone for the setting that you're in, and that soundtrack does such an excellent job of doing that. Now, after having broken down the soundtrack, I want to kind of break down the bits of the film that I enjoy the most. The things that I don't enjoy, and which are very few, and kind of my feelings on the legacy of the movie. Let's get into it. If I could, if I had the wherewithal, if I had the following, if I had the people behind me, I would 100% do a scene-by-scene, shot-by-shot breakdown analysis of this movie, because that is how much I love this film. However, I do not have the following to do that. I do not have the money to do that. And if I did do that, I would most certainly be demonetized by YouTube. So, we're not going to do a scene-by-scene, shot-by-shot breakdown, but we are going to kind of go section by section and talk about the things that I really enjoy, the things that essentially I'm going to be listing all the reasons why I love this movie. Starting with the opening scenes in the film. So the opening scene introduces us to the boys first, and the shot of those boys walking around the carousel into the frame is just so cool. There's something just really cool and awesome about that visual of the four of David, Dwayne, Paul, Marco walking in a row kind of around that carousel, and it's all foggy and smoky. And they're just kind of looking cool and sexy and badass in their leather and their fishnet in the case of Paul. But it was just so cool, and it really set the tone for they're hot, but they're dangerous. Insert Bill Hader's Mark Me Down as Scared and Horny. That's the tone it sets. It really does set that tone of like, oh, they're really attractive, but oh god, they're also very scary. And that really does kind of set the tone. And I mean, another really cool thing visually about the film is that in regards to the SFX aspect of it, we never actually see the boys flying in action until the last 30 minutes of the movie. We don't get to see it until that final confrontation moment happens. And that's because they were kind of saving up all of that really cool big budget stuff that they could do for the end. Which brings me to another thing, the vampire prosthetics that were used in the film. Because at the time the film came out in 1987, the last time there'd really been a vampire on screen was Christopher Lee's Dracula. And Lost Boys really changed what vampires visually could be in regards to them being really, really beautiful all the time, but making them just really kind of ugly when they have to feed, when they have to go into that feast mode. And Lost Boys was the first one to ever change that kind of a narrative, because we'd had Nosferatu and Dracula, and I mean, Nosferatu was the last time we really had like an ugly vampire, because you had Christopher Lee's Dracula, which is one of the longest running series of Dracula, the Hammer Films franchise, and then you had Anne Rice beginning to write the Vampire Chronicles back in the 1978 is when Interview with the Vampire was published, but there was really no hot to ugly vampire. And that's what Lost Boys created. And I actually got to do a really cool kind of Sinister CyberCon was hosted several weeks ago, and I participated. And one of the guests that they had was one of the people who was on the SFX team for The Lost Boys. So I got to ask him how he and V. Neal, who people will probably recognize from Face Off because she was one of the artists on The Lost Boys as well, he and V. Neal worked together to create the prosthesis that would create that really iconic vampire face, that ridged forehead, the very angular cheeks, essentially the face of a bat on the body of a person. And the story he gave for coming up with that was probably one of the coolest, weirdest things I'd ever heard. Because he had this picture of a tennis player in his pocket. And over time it got worn and faded so much that it looked like there were these ridges on his forehead, and it made his face look much more sinister and angular. So he took that picture, that image, and used that to kind of create the forehead pieces for the boys. And that's the inspiration for what became one of the most kind of revolutionary vampire faces in like the late 80s, early 90s. It was a new type of vampire. And they created that from a faded picture of a tennis player. And I thought that was just so cool, because those prosthetics, like, you never seen anything like that before. And they really were never able to replicate it again, even in the sequels for Lost Boys, because I hate the prosthetics for the Lost Boys sequels. They weren't as good. Just to put it simply, the prosthetics in the sequels were not as good. It didn't have the same feeling, and it made them look more like werewolves than vampires, and I was really disappointed in that. But the prosthetics were such a huge part of kind of making the boys seem as scary as they were supposed to, because there's always that hint of danger, but then you see them turn to look at Michael with these red-yellow eyes and these front teeth and these angular cheekbones and this ridged forehead, and you're just like, oh, you were hot a second ago. What happened? What happened to all the sexy? And it's just gone. And I think that made such an impact on the scene where we kind of hear the slogan said out loud for the first time, and that is the beach party, the surf massacre scene. And it's, ironically, the song that was used in that scene didn't make it onto the soundtrack, which I'm a little disappointed about. But essentially, the Lost Boys go to a beach party. It's a bonfire, and there's a group of kind of surfers who call themselves the Surf for some reason. And there's a scene right before they go into this. They bring Michael with them, and David says, "Initiation's over, Michael, time to join the club." And then when Michael looks up, all of them have like their monster faces on, and they just charge in, and essentially they massacre this whole bonfire to Walk This Way by Run DMC and Aerosmith. It's a really great scene, and I'm really sad that song isn't on the soundtrack, but it's just this scene of absolute carnage, which is where I learned that if you put salt on a fire, it will burn blue, green, and purple instead of red, yellow, and white. Science, I guess. But it's just this absolute scene of carnage. It's one of the bloodiest scenes in the movie. But afterwards, Michael kind of throws himself off of this tree they're hiding in, and he lands and he tries to keep himself from joining them and feeding with them. And when the boys are done, when everybody is dead, they stop and their faces are just normal again, but they're all like drenched in blood. And David, Dwayne, Paul, and Marco come up this hill, and they just stand there looking down on Michael, who's like in the middle of these two dunes. David looks down at him and says, now you know what we are, now you know what you are. You'll never grow old, Michael. You'll never die, but you must feed. And if that wasn't the coolest, most mind-bending moment in the entire film, I don't know what was, because that scene showed that, yeah, they're pretty. They're really pretty. But they're also extremely bloodthirsty, murderous monsters. And it's the first time we really see the boys do anything that is explicitly monstrous in the entire film. And it's such an impactful moment. And just the image is so cool. I'll try and I'll put a picture of that particular moment. But that moment is just one of the most impactful things in the entire film. There's only one thing that I really don't like about this movie, And that is, there are several deleted scenes with a character who is very briefly introduced, Maria, who is the other cashier at Max's store. Now, there are deleted scenes where she does have more of a kind of a character, but they cut it. She has a scene where she interacts with Lucy when Lucy starts working for Max. And it's a very cute scene that shows kind of the camaraderie between the two women, and they cut it from the film. So Maria is there, and she is a character who is shown several times, but is never actually explicitly used for anything, and I feel like they kind of wasted the potential of that particular character. And that's really the only thing I don't like, is the wasted potential of that character specifically. Now that I've talked about that, let's get into the legacy of the film and the remake. The legacy of the film is one that kind of does tend to endure in more classic horror fan circles, though it will get more mainstream attention coming up very soon, considering that the passing of Joel Schumacher will probably now allow for a new generation, a new younger audience to kind of introduce themselves to the film, because they've had parents who loved it back in the day when it came out. And it's such an interesting and cool movie, and now those kids are of an age where, hey, I can sit and watch this really cool vampire movie with my parents. And I mean, Kiefer Sutherland even said that he didn't show his kids the movie, they found it on their own. And then they came up to him and were like, you were in this. And I think that's just a really fun thing. But the unfortunate passing of Joel Schumacher will, I think, allow a new generation of people who are fans then to kind of bring their kids who are old enough to watch the film into this really cool, weird story now. And also, we'll get a little bit more attention with the slated TV movie remake set to star Tyler Posey of Teen Wolf, and directed by the legendary, incredible, and severely underrated Catherine Hardwicke, who many of you will remember as the director of the only good Twilight film, Twilight 2008, directed by Catherine Hardwicke. And she is slated to direct this. It's almost a remake, but it's taking elements of the story that Joel Schumacher wanted to incorporate far earlier, and adding them in. It's adding more women and more people of color, and I'm really excited to see that. And that's something that Joel Schumacher wanted to do. Watching an interview with Joel Schumacher about the film, his intention was to either release a prequel sequel called Lost Boys: The Beginning, which for quite some time was actually available to read publicly, and I read it several times. It was a really cool story and explained the origins of how the boys came to be vampires, and paved the way for kind of a third middle film, because there was a fifth lost boy named Jasper who disappears sometime between the beginning and the Lost Boys. So it would have been really cool to kind of watch those boys go through that journey. But he also approached this Warner Brothers about a gender bend sequel, which I think would have also been really cool. And I think that Catherine Hardwicke's addition of more women and more people of color is really a tribute to Joel Schumacher wanting to kind of push the boundaries of what he could do with this film. And I do appreciate that. And I think Catherine Hardwicke is going to take this film under her wing and do something so incredible with it. And I'm really excited to see what she'll do. The cast list looks amazing already. I'm really happy with it. It's going to be really interesting to see what she does with such an iconic, classic subject matter. And I'm really glad that she was handed off the reins to this, because watching interviews with her, she found it very difficult to get work after directing Twilight, despite the fact that she directed the only one that was never nominated for a Razzie, and arguably had the most iconic blue filter ever, and the best baseball scene ever, and also the best soundtrack of the entire series. Supermassive black hole slaps, and you can't argue with me on that. It's good. The baseball scene was legendary, and Catherine Hardwicke would have given us a baseball scene in every film. We were robbed. Anyway, Catherine Hardwicke directing Lost Boys, I think, will be a chance for her to redeem herself in regards to not being valued as a director after directing a franchise that was so popular and was made popular off of her work with the first movie of the Twilight franchise. And I'm really excited to see her take that over, especially now that Joel Schumacher has passed. It is kind of a literal passing of the torch from Joel Schumacher's hands into Catherine's, and I am very excited to see where she runs with that torch. Now that we've talked about everything that I felt is really necessary about the movie, let's get into final thoughts. The Lost Boys has kind of always been a really interesting film for me in regards to having kind of grown up in the Twilight era and the advent of Twilight, having read the Twilight books, having seen all of the films, and then going from Twilight into Melissa de la Cruz's Blue Bloods, and the Vampire Academy by Rachel Mead, and then as I got older, the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. I've always kind of really been drawn to the supernatural, specifically vampires. And The Lost Boys was something really cool for me to see, simply because it was a different way of seeing vampires. It wasn't the calm, cool, collected, but also very bratty and belligerent Lestat. It wasn't Dracula. It wasn't this refined old man living in a decrepit castle. It had the same feel of Queen of the Damned. It was a bunch of punk-ass, leather-wearing douches riding motorcycles in the middle of a public place where there were people that they could run over, and they didn't care. It was a vampire movie for a new generation of vampire fans. It is what the Queen of the Damned film tried to be and failed to be. But Lost Boys did it in a way that really met the era they were trying to speak to. And I think that is something that is why the film is so enduring, because it stands up over time. I mean, Lost Boys came out in 1987. So the film is over 30 years old now. And it's a film that still manages to hold its own against newer vampire films that come out. I mean, that is the legacy of the movie, is that it kind of continues to endure and be a good, watchable film, even now, over 30 years later. And I think that's something that's so important about really the legacy of the filmmaking that Joel Schumacher did with this movie, is that he created something that is going to last probably until horror becomes obsolete, which it never will, because horror always remains relevant, which is the most important thing about this movie, is that it remains relevant. And yeah, if you haven't seen Lost Boys, you should. And I mean, it's available to stream, no longer on Netflix. They took it off permanently a while back, but you can purchase it on iTunes, on Vudu, I believe, also has it. But if you haven't seen it, check it out, because it really is worth the watch. So that about wraps us up for this episode of One-Off Wonders, and I will see everybody, excepting any massive deaths that are huge blows to me emotionally, on Monday for our next episode of Market Music. Bye.